The show began with the usual light-hearted jokes from Jimmy Kimmel, but the energy shifted the moment Pam Bondi appeared on set. She walked out with confidence, greeting Jimmy with a composed smile, yet tension was already visible in the room. The audience clapped, but it wasn't the enthusiastic cheer that usually welcomed guests. There was a subtle unease in the air, like everyone could sense something was about to erupt. Jimmy opened the conversation politely, bringing up Bondi's past legal work on recent political commentary. She responded calmly at first, defending her decisions and backing her statements with facts she believed to be solid. Jimmy nodded, letting her speak, but his facial expressions hinted at skepticism. Then, he leaned forward slightly, raised an eyebrow, and asked a pointed question about her involvement with the 2020 election controversies. The tone turned serious instantly. Pam's posture stiffened. She tried to pivot, changing the topic slightly, but Jimmy wasn't letting it slide. He interrupted politely but firmly, quoting her own words and presenting contradictory evidence from news reports. The audience shifted in their seats, the tension now thick and audible. Pam attempted to defend herself, raising her voice slightly, claiming bias in media and unfair representation. Jimmy smiled tightly and asked whether undermining the electoral process was really about justice or something else entirely. Her expression hardened. She fired back with accusations of media manipulation and late-night hosts pushing political agendas. Jimmy chuckled, sarcastically at first, and then turned serious, saying that comedy and truth aren't mutually exclusive. The exchange escalated. Pam's responses became more defensive, her voice louder. Jimmy, though composed, grew sharper with his remarks. At one point, Pam asked if she was invited just to be attacked. Jimmy replied that she was invited to answer questions, not deliver speeches unchecked. A murmur ran through the audience, some clapping, some booing. The conversation was no longer a discussion, it was a standoff. Jimmy asked a final question, referencing her role during the impeachment hearings. Pam refused to answer directly and accused the show of ambushing her. That was the tipping point. The crowd buzzed, with whispers and reactions echoing throughout the studio. A producer approached the edge of the set, clearly concerned. Jimmy attempted to pivot to a lighter question to defuse the moment, but Pam stood up, removing her mic and saying, "This isn't a conversation, it's a trap." The room fell silent. Jimmy leaned back, visibly stunned. Pam turned, walked off stage without another word. The studio remained frozen for a moment, and then erupted into a mix of cheers, gasps, and stunned laughter. Jimmy looked at the camera and said, "Well, that was unexpected," trying to reclaim control of the moment. The segment ended abruptly, cutting to a commercial, leaving viewers and the audience in disbelief. The lights were bright, the music upbeat, and the crowd full of energy as Jimmy Kimmel stepped out to start the show. Everything felt like a typical late-night episode until the moment Pam Bondi was introduced. She emerged from backstage with a stiff smile, waving to the audience, though the reception was noticeably mixed. Some clapped, others stayed silent. A few even booed under their breath. She took her seat next to Jimmy, and the two exchanged a few pleasantries. But from the start, there was a strange undertone. Jimmy went into his opening questions with unfamiliar charm, but it was clear he had come prepared to challenge her on some serious issues. The audience sensed it, too. Bondi answered the first few questions without hesitation, but her tone quickly shifted when Jimmy brought up her work during Trump's impeachment trial and her role in the post-election legal efforts. She tried to laugh it off, but Jimmy pushed back harder, not letting her deflect. She grew tense, leaning forward, her voice rising slightly. Jimmy didn't raise his voice, but the sarcasm in his tone was sharp, drawing a few awkward laughs from the crowd. Then came a particularly tense moment when Jimmy read a quote from one of her past interviews and asked if she still stood by it. Pam immediately accused him of taking it out of context. Jimmy raised an eyebrow and calmly replied that he had the entire transcript. The tension became palpable. The conversation spiraled as Bondi tried to steer it back to her narrative, while Jimmy countered with facts, headlines, and pointed questions. She clearly didn't expect the tone of the interview to be so confrontational. She began to raise her voice more, trying to assert control of the narrative, but Jimmy stayed steady, challenging each statement with a mix of fact and satire. Pam stood up mid-sentence. The audience gasped. It wasn't clear if she was just shifting in frustration or actually preparing to leave, but the energy shifted instantly. Jimmy, still in his chair, looked surprised. She accused the show of setting her up, called it a political ambush, and removed her mic. Jimmy tried to speak, but she cut him off, pointing toward the cameras and calling the entire production biased. Someone backstage motioned toward her, likely a producer, but Bondi had already decided. She walked straight off the set, ignoring the stage manager, the audience, and Jimmy's attempt to respond. The audience erupted not with applause or boos, but with stunned chatter, confusion, and disbelief. Jimmy turned back to the camera with the stunned expression, unsure of what to say for a moment. Then he finally muttered, "Well, that's a first." The crowd reacted, some laughing nervously, others still unsure what had just happened. The screen faded quickly to a commercial, leaving behind a room full of unresolved tension and a moment that would be replayed across social media for days. The studio lights gleamed as the audience settled in for another evening of entertainment, but the energy took an unexpected turn as the interview with Pam Bondi began. The initial exchange between Jimmy Kimmel and Pam seemed formal, almost tense, with both sticking to scripted lines and polite smiles. Jimmy began with surface-level questions, but it was only a matter of time before he veered into more controversial territory. He brought up Bondi's public defense of Trump and her legal involvement during the impeachment. His tone was calm but piercing, the kind that challenged without shouting. The audience, usually relaxed and laughing, grew more focused, sensing that things were about to get serious. Pam adjusted in her seat, attempting to control the narrative. She fired back with long, deliberate answers, laced with political rhetoric and defense of her record. Jimmy let her speak, nodding slightly, but his follow-up questions became increasingly sharp. He quoted specific events, contrasted her statements with public records, and drew attention to contradictions in her past interviews. As the tension rose, an audible gasp came from the audience when Jimmy subtly accused her of enabling disinformation. Pam's smile faded. She tried to redirect the conversation, bringing up unrelated topics, but Jimmy refused to let her off the hook. He leaned in slightly, speaking firmly, and asked if she truly believed in what she defended or if it was just partisan loyalty. That moment triggered a reaction in the crowd. Some audience members gasped, a few cheered softly, others whispered among themselves. Pam tried to maintain composure but responded with a tone that was defensive, nearly trembling. She claimed the media, and by extension Jimmy himself, were distorting the truth. The tension exploded when she accused the show of staging the moment for entertainment. Jimmy responded quickly, saying, "No one scripted your answers." That line drew a mix of laughter and stunned silence. Pam raised her voice, arguing over him, and the audience shifted uncomfortably. Then came the breaking point. Jimmy held up a printed article highlighting a case she worked on and read a portion aloud. Pam cut in, saying it was taken out of context, but Jimmy pushed again. The volume rose. Pam's frustration was now fully visible. Her voice echoed across the set as she declared that she was being treated unfairly, saying, "You're not looking for truth, you're looking for ratings." Jimmy replied, "Sometimes, truth is what gets ratings." That line landed hard. The audience gasped again. Some clapped, some stayed silent, unsure how to process what was happening. Pam stood up slightly in her chair as if ready to walk, but she stayed seated, gripping the armrest. Jimmy turned to the audience with a smirk that quickly faded, realizing the moment had escalated beyond a bit. The air was thick with tension, every breath and glance charged with emotion. It was no longer entertainment, it had become a public confrontation, and everyone in the room knew they were witnessing something that would go viral within minutes. The tension was already thick before the conversation even began. Jimmy Kimmel greeted Pam Bondi with a professional smile, but his eyes carried a weight that hinted this wouldn't be a smooth interview. Pam, clearly aware of the setting, entered with practiced confidence and a firm handshake, sitting down with the posture of someone ready to defend herself. The audience gave a light applause, but the usual warmth wasn't there. It felt muted, cautious. Jimmy started with a few warm-up questions, laced with subtle jabs, testing the waters. Pam responded calmly, her voice steady, but her eyes occasionally flickered with irritation. She seemed ready, as if she had predicted this wouldn't be a friendly chat. Then Jimmy pivoted sharply. He brought up her televised defense during Trump's impeachment and questioned the motivation behind her involvement. Pam tried to steer the answer toward legality and principles, but Jimmy pressed harder. His tone sharpened, and he pointed out the political connections and how her statements echoed certain talking points almost word for word. Pam bristled. She spoke louder now, defending her integrity, accusing Jimmy of misrepresenting facts. The audience began murmuring. Some people leaned forward. Others glanced around, trying to read the room. Jimmy wasn't holding back anymore. He interrupted her to clarify statements, called out inconsistencies, and asked directly, "Are you here to be honest or to rewrite the story?" That line hit hard. Pam's face stiffened. She leaned forward, cutting him off mid-sentence, accusing him of not letting her speak. He responded, "I'm trying to get a straight answer." Now the room was fully charged. Every pause felt like a standoff. Pam countered with her own accusations, saying late-night hosts were part of a cultural elite that mocked real Americans. The audience shifted again as some clapped. Others booed. Jimmy looked directly at her and said, "Mocking hypocrisy isn't the same as mocking the people." The air cracked with reaction. Pam raised her voice again, claiming she was set up, that this wasn't a fair platform. Jimmy calmly said, "You're not being silenced, you're just being asked to explain yourself." Her face turned red. The intensity had reached its peak. She stood up, pointed toward the audience, and said they were being manipulated. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, letting the moment speak for itself. Pam sat back down abruptly, perhaps realizing storming off would give him the final word. But the interview was already collapsing. She interrupted him again, and he responded with dry sarcasm, pushing back without raising his voice. The audience was fully engaged, reacting to every exchange with gasps, whispers, occasional claps. It had become a war of tone as her volume versus his precision. Then, with one final statement, she snapped, "You're not interested in truth, you're interested in a headline." Jimmy replied, "Then you shouldn't have given us one." The audience exploded. Some stood, some clapped, others watched in stunned silence. The cameras stayed steady, but even the crew could feel it. This wasn't a debate, it was a public unraveling. As the interview spiraled out of control, the atmosphere in the studio turned thick with tension. Pam Bondi, who had walked onto the stage with confidence and composure, now sat rigid in her chair, voice raised and eyes flaring with frustration. Jimmy Kimmel, though still calm in appearance, had sharpened his tone. His questions were direct, pointed, and laced with subtle sarcasm that only further ignited Pam's anger. The crowd, initially quiet and confused, began to stir. Murmurs echoed throughout the studio, some laughing nervously, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. What was once a standard late-night interview had transformed into a showdown live on national television. Pam accused Jimmy of ambushing her, saying she was being unfairly targeted. Jimmy countered, stating that guests should expect to be held accountable, especially when they've played major roles in national controversies. Pam stood up abruptly, pulling off her mic pack and gesturing toward the crew. "I'm done being your punching bag," she snapped. Jimmy tried to regain control, but his attempt to defuse the situation with humor only made things worse. Pam walked away from her seat, heading toward the side of the stage. Suddenly, the audience gasped, and not because she was leaving, but because security personnel appeared near the edge of the set. One producer stood near the curtain, signaling to the team, while another tried to usher Pam calmly backstage. But Pam wasn't finished. She turned back toward Jimmy, yelling across the stage that this was exactly what was wrong with media in America. Her voice echoed, sharp and angry. Jimmy remained seated, watching quietly as she continued her tirade. A security guard stepped slightly forward, but didn't intervene physically. Instead, he stood still, clearly instructed only to be present in case the situation escalated further. The audience erupted into scattered shouting, as some defending Pam, others cheering Jimmy. Chaos had officially taken over. Jimmy finally stood, not to confront her, but to bring order. Okay, we don't need to do this," he said, trying to de-escalate. Pam, still fuming, looked around the room, then finally stormed off, disappearing behind the curtain with security and staff following behind. Jimmy turned back toward the audience, his face a mix of disbelief and irritation. "Well, that was a moment," he said, trying to break the tension with the smirk. But the mood had already shifted beyond comedy. The audience, unsure whether to applaud or remain silent, reacted in scattered claps and murmurs. Cameras were still rolling, and the entire exchange was being captured unfiltered. Jimmy sighed, looked directly at the camera, and said, "We'll be right back." The screen cut to commercial, but the energy in the room lingered, a chaotic, electric, and unforgettable.